Whoever's the owner of the white sedan, you left your lights on.
Remnant 2, man. I think it's safe to say that Remnant 1 was my favourite game of 2019. Everything about that game, the mechanics, the gameplay loop, the bosses, the loot, and more importantly, the casual take on a Souls-like shooter really appealed to me in a way that a lot of other co-op games fail to do so. It was, and still is, a game that I look back on very fondly, and one that I've personally played through 3 times, and each time enjoying it just as much as the first. And although I was excited for Remnant 2, I must say I managed to keep my expectations in check, as I had faith that if the game was any similar to the first, I would enjoy it just as much, or at the very least, get a good time out of it. And I think it was hard to visualize Gunfire games doing anything really wild with the IP other than add more worlds, bosses, and loot, and I don't think there was any way for them to steer this ship wrong, and the previews of the game indicated as much. As such, I think I came in with very level or neutral expectations, and the game is similar to the first. Very similar, in fact. Structurally, gameplay-wise, tonally, this game builds off the path that its predecessor laid before it, with some improvements in terms of environmental design and changes to character classes, but where Remnant 2 builds where the previous game was lacking, I think it also made some changes where it didn't really need to. I'll talk about this later in the review, as well as some of the comments on PC performance, as yeah, there's a little bit left to be desired, but I've had a really good time with it, and I think fans of the franchise, although potentially frustrated by some of its changes, will ultimately like it too, as at its core, it's more Remnant. Anyway, there's a lot to talk about, so let's get to it.
Yes. It's me.
Remnant 2, sequel to Remnant from the Ashes, released back in 2019, is a third-person co-op boss-hunting Souls-like looter shooter, whereby you explore different worlds, seeking out and hunting bosses with the intention of restoring and saving your dilapidated world that has been overrun and infected with a parasite known as the Root. You can play solo or team up with 2 other players, and throughout your playthrough you will travel through various worlds, hunting for said bosses, collecting new guns, items, armor, and upgrading your character along the way. Starting out, you'll do a quick tutorial before arriving at your base of operations, Ward 13. Here you'll be introduced to the team and merchants that you'll be interacting with throughout your playthrough, as well as being able to select your archetype, the new updated class system in Remnant 2. Selecting one of the 4 starter classes doesn't limit you to what guns or equipment you can use, but does grant you use of certain abilities that are class specific, as well as orientate you to more of a specific playstyle, like the Hunter that is better geared towards precision weapons, Challenger that is more towards melee and short range, or Medic that's geared towards using skills and healing. I'll touch more on this archetype system later, but from here you then venture out into the world to explore, finding secrets and items such as armor that gives you different elemental resistances and damage reduction, as well as rings and amulets that give you certain bonuses like 5% heal after killing an enemy, or increased ranged or increased fire rate or damage reduction, allowing you to tailor your build into more specific playstyles, be it tanky or damage. You'll also find dungeons holding host to puzzles, events, and bosses, killing which will drop new traits and crafting components which you can cash into this gunsmith lady to craft either new guns, melee weapons, or weapon mods. Mods you can attach to certain guns that grant you certain abilities that recharge when you deal damage with said gun. Eventually you'll find the world boss, which when killed will then allow you to unlock the next world, hosting more puzzles, dungeons, and loot, and the whole process repeats. It's very similar to the first game, and is a gameplay loop and combat system that I thoroughly enjoyed, with a big emphasis on dodging, exploration, and treasure hunting, and is why this game is often referred to as Souls-like, as Dark Souls follows a similar linear structure, crafting system, and combat system, and I'm happy that the devs chose not to try and mess with this loop, as it's one of the things that makes this game so good. Structurally, this game is very similar to the first. When entering a new world, you'll be introduced to a sort of base area that acts as the trunk of the map. From here, various pathways branch out, taking the form of dungeons, which you find by exploring the map, and of which there's usually 3 to 5 per world. One such dungeon will lead you through to the main quest line, as indicated by this quest marker, whilst the others will hold a variety of bosses and puzzles, as well as extra loot and secrets for you to explore before spitting you back out to the main map, where you'll then progress onto the next one.
I'm just taking guesses. Oh, I got it.
Oh my god.
No shot. Oh!
What the hell?
I had to guess any time possible.
It's relatively linear, but it's given depth by the procedural generation, where each map will attach a set of different dungeons on a different playthrough, meaning that you will need multiple playthroughs to encounter every boss and get every bit of loot. This does sound a bit exhausting, but different to the first game where you had adventure mode which re-rolled your whole campaign to get a different world seed and therefore different dungeons, Remnant 2 allows you to do adventure mode for specific worlds. It means you don't have to grind as much to get to the bosses that you missed. There are also special events that can take place in the main map, which also have a random chance of occurring, building upon this idea that no playthrough will be similar. Although you can search the environment to find all the secrets that this world holds, and there are a lot of secrets, this game generally steers you in the direction of the dungeons, and therefore the next set of bosses to fight, and you never really have to venture off too far from the main path to find what secrets this game does have to offer. It's a refreshingly simple approach to map design, and is a very nice break from the massive open worlds of things like Elden Ring and Hogwarts Legacy. I don't know. It's nice to play a linear game every once in a while, and again, the procedural generation within the map encourages second playthroughs or world rerolls, as you are likely to experience something completely different exploring the world a second time. I played this game through once in co-op, and about halfway through a solo run, and although the worlds I got were the same with slight variations, each dungeon was different between my two playthroughs, which is encouraging to see. And in starting off with what I think this game does well, personally I think the biggest improvement Gunfire did with this game in comparison to the first, at least from an atmospheric point of view, is the world design. In terms of environment, I think Remnant 2 really built upon the foundations that Remnant 1 had laid out before it. In the first game, the worlds were very static. None of the environments felt particularly lived in, and there was nothing really to take away from the surroundings, as the map was essentially walled off by trees or buildings. It left the environment lacking a sense of scale, or maybe even a sense of character. It was as if the developers were more concerned with fleshing out and building the rest of the components of the game, and the environment was left a little bit undercooked. Remnant 2 is still a relatively closed-off map, albeit a bit bigger. However, the environments that have been built within this space feel so much more atmospheric and lively than the first. The first game felt like each world was kind of just a retexture of the last, with similar topography. Here in Remnant 2, they feel structurally different, as if each world's skeleton is different. Some worlds having more verticality, giving enemies more opportunity to shoot you from above or behind, others having more open space, giving off feelings of emptiness and distance and breadth, and inviting you to fight more at range. Others have confined spaces, making gameplay feel tighter and more constricted, and it resulted in the gunplay feeling a little different from each environment, which contributed to differentiating each new world from the previous. Abandoned cobblestone streets with riding mobs wielding cleavers and knives, the houses towering above and tight alleyways bearing down on you, very much giving off a Bloodborne type vibe. Another, a castle with libraries and suits of armor where you're running across parapets, resembling that of the Grand Archive in Dark Souls. I think one environment that surprised me the most was the Labyrinth. Returning from Remnant 1, the Labyrinth acts as your realm between realms, where you venture through to unlock new paths into new worlds. However, Gunfire, in the process of scaling up the Labyrinth, also turned it into a world itself, holding host to its own set of puzzles and enemies and bosses, and looks particularly cool, like some sort of fractured Aztec planet. Where each environment in Remnant 1 lacked this sense of personality, Remnant 2's locations hold so much more character that it's exciting moving through each of them, and stops them feeling so samey. I think every time I entered a new world in this game, I found myself saying, this is sick. And the enemy design in this game contributes to that too. Each world has a different array of enemies to fight with different designs, attacks, and combat styles, from light mobs to what we've just generally coined as mages, which adds to the sense of each world feeling different and holding its own unique character. It's clear that the devs put a lot of thought into each of the enemy designs, and none of the enemies feel lackluster or a cop-out. And the bosses are good too. I will say that the boss encounters are really impacted by how many players you play with. I think 2 players is the perfect number, as the boss still applies pressure, but occasionally you get some breaks. 1 is good, but just very hard as there's no downtime, and 3 is fine too, but some fights can feel a little easy. There are some bosses that really set themselves apart from one another, and some that feel a little similar, not in terms of visual design, but maybe in the mechanics and movesets. But honestly, I've only seen a portion of the bosses that this game has to offer due to the way its procedural generation works, and some bosses really stand out. For me, the Labyrinth boss fight I thought was particularly cool, as well as the Nightweaver and the process of getting up to that boss fight, and Shalalala, or whatever he's called. I think both of those were also excellent boss fights. I will say that playing solo opposed to co-op really makes me appreciate the designs a lot more, as there's a lot more focus on learning telegraphs and attack patterns. And to this game's credit, some of these boss fights are genuinely difficult. Most I would say required me and my friends to restart a couple of times, and others required twice, if not 3 or 4 as many restarts. Which is great, as that's what I like to get out of games like these. It's that trial and error and that grind to learn attack patterns and combinations, and the most memorable boss fights were the ones that we grinded at and could breathe a sigh of relief once defeated.
Fucking hard.
That's the kind of boss I like.
Guns, armor, and rings back. I'll talk about armor later on, but in regards to guns, you have shotguns, rifles, pistols, and variations of such depending on which boss you kill and what crafting components get dropped. Some of the old favourites return, like the assault rifle, SMG, machine pistol, and the Chicago typewriter, and a whole bunch of new ones that I won't spoil for you, but some have some pretty cool designs, like this gravity gun that reloads by bouncing bullets of enemies back into the gun, which at short range turns into a sort of SMG. I will say that I think there is something to say about the pacing of getting guns, mainly that I don't really like how the machine pistol and the assault rifle and machine guns are available to purchase at the very start of the game. I feel like it would have done much better for the pacing if you unlocked them later on, as it gives you reasons to trial other guns, as those base weapons are just so good to start off with. But you know, you can force yourself to use other guns or opt not to use them, so this issue can be avoided. But yeah, gunplay feels good. You can also unlock weapon mods, which are abilities that you can purchase from the gunsmith or craft from crafting components, and that you can attach to guns that have mod slots available. These return from Remnant 1, and I'm glad they're back in this game, adding a bit more to the depth of gunplay. In terms of rings and amulets, they serve a similar function to the first game, giving you buffs and letting you spec into different playstyles. I feel like there's a lot more variety to the rings in this game. I can't be sure, as I can't remember how many rings were in the first, but it feels like my inventory quickly filled with rings, each doing different things, and it's great. Though there are a lot in my inventory that I know I will never use, and I wish instead I found more guns and mods than rings, as it feels like I picked up 15 rings in one world and only one gun. It depends a bit on the procedural generation RNG. They also added different forms of dragon hearts, which serve as your Estus flask, which was a surprise. And although they didn't really fit in with the build that I was using, I'm glad they added it, again, for a bit more variability in one's buildcraft. There are also a few smaller things I think the game does better than the first. Firstly, this game is more forgiving to solo players. Although still primarily designed to be played co-op, compared to the first game, Remnant 2 has a few more features that make solo play a bit more viable. Things like the handler archetype that allows your dog to revive you, or the challenger archetype that grants you essentially a free revive before you die, are nice additions to make solo play a bit more accessible. Don't get me wrong, it's still hard playing solo, and at times it can be very unforgiving when you die miles from your world stone and have to restart the dungeon all over again. But in terms of moment-to-moment combat, I think it's a bit better than the first game. They also made melee builds a bit more viable, which is nice. I haven't tried it out yet, but I certainly picked up a hell of a lot of rings related to melee builds, so I'm sure there's something there. The map's also been updated to a more 3D design, and although it is better in terms of functionality and readability, and indicates when you've explored certain dungeons or not, which is a nice touch as you tend to get a bit disorientated when a dungeon spits you out in a different location, it would have been nice if it revealed where your teammates have explored, but that's just a small gripe. I also like the changes to the class system. I think it's nice having an extra ability to use alongside your weapon mods, and after the first world boss is defeated, you can unlock the ability to equip 2 archetypes on the same character, allowing you to swap through different combinations and use their different abilities, which is cool, as if you're not gelling with one class, you're free to swap to another, although it's important to note that some of the starter archetypes are unlocked after defeating a certain world boss, and you can also unlock new archetypes by completing certain puzzles or finding certain loot in some of the worlds. I'll be honest, I only really paid attention to the abilities that each class gave me. If I paid more attention, I probably could have got more out of each of their specific class traits, but I was kind of just exploring everything in my first playthrough and experimenting with different stuff, so I wasn't particularly synergized, but again, I like this change.
Oh, these things are moving when you look away.
Oh god, yeah.
Oh,
Power.
two pack a punch.
Now I'm going to move on to talking on some of the other features and systems in the game, and some of the things that didn't quite land for me. Firstly, from a systems point of view, I want to talk about performance and bugs. Regarding performance, man, FPS was an issue for me in this game. Throughout the whole campaign, my co-op playthrough FPS fluctuated between 45 and 70 FPS depending on the location, with the open world segment being consistently around 50 FPS and the dungeons holding more of a steady 60. Although it was still playable, this made boss fights particularly more annoying, as although I wouldn't say 45 FPS is game breaking, it definitely makes timing and aiming and fighting bosses more difficult, as you can definitely feel how choppy it is. And entering a dungeon and having the FPS spike back up to 60 made me realize how bad playing majority of this game at 45 FPS really felt. And what was interesting is that I found I had more consistent 60 to 70 FPS playing solo than I did co-op. In my solo playthrough, I found I didn't have nearly as many FPS drops, and I get that there is more things going on in co-op regarding animations and effects or whatever, but enough to drop 10 to 15 frames? I don't know, something ain't right. And I found the movement and combat and dodging was a lot more fine-tuned in my solo playthrough as well, and made me lament that I didn't have this same level of performance during my co-op playthrough. And one could argue that my system is outdated, but my friends were playing on 3000 series graphics cards, and they too were maintaining lower than expected FPS that fluctuated a lot, again floating around 60 FPS, and changing the settings from high to medium to low did nothing to affect that, which tells me it's not my hardware that's the problem, but the software in the game. I've read on some forums that a lot of the other players are calling for more performance optimizations, but yeah, the FPS definitely made co-op a bit more difficult to enjoy. And although the fluctuating FPS did impact my enjoyment a little bit, I felt like there were some issues with the aiming. It felt just a bit off, like the mouse actions I was performing wasn't quite mirroring what was going on screen, and in googling this issue I read some posts that have stated that this game uses something called negative mouse acceleration, which was turned on by default and can't be changed in the settings. Negative mouse acceleration, from what I understand, means that for slower mouse movements the game will accelerate the cursor, and for faster mouse movements it'll slow the cursor down. So currently the camera sensitivity in the game isn't representing raw mouse input, but is being modified by this negative acceleration. Apparently this was also an issue in the first game, which I didn't notice, but I definitely feel it now a bit more, and is supposed to be linked to FPS. It didn't bother me too much whilst I was playing, but apparently it's bothering a lot of people, or so the discussion board tells me, and it was a gripe a lot of people had with the first game. But yeah, there are definitely situations where I've just found it very hard to stay on track with targets, often overshooting or undershooting my crosshair placement, which is important when you're trying to shoot enemies' weak spots, an issue that isn't helped by the choppy reduced FPS. I've also run into a few bugs. Again, nothing game breaking, but I think me and my friends may have crashed once in our 20 hours of game time, but particularly with one of the first boss fights in Yesha, there's this mechanic where the boss will break apart some of the map, and you need to get off it before he does, else you fall to your death. Occasionally, if the boss breaks the part of the map and you later die, on respawn when you go back in, although the textures have loaded in, the collisions haven't reset, so you'll just run onto the platform that appears to be loaded in and fall through the map and die. I didn't experience this in any other segment or boss fight, just this one, but the fact that it was in the first main boss fight, I think I died to it like 6 out of 10 or 12 times we ran that boss. It didn't bode well for the rest of the playthrough. Thankfully, this is the only real frustrating bug I encountered. Occasionally it felt like some of the enemy attack animations clearly missed my character, but it would still register a hit. Other than that, I think the game ran as intended for the most part, besides the FPS. Moving on to some of the changes to the systems in the game, starting off with the new class and trait system. I touched on the class specific traits earlier. I know class variety was non-existent in the first game, and I like that developers have made more of an attempt to try and diversify the classes a bit more, and although that I like each class has a different set of abilities, I did not gel with how it relates to traits. In Remnant 1, you unlock traits by doing certain tasks, like reviving teammates a certain number of times or by reloading a lot, and as you leveled up you can put more trait points into these to increase their stats, and although there were a lot of meaningless stats in there that I didn't use, there was so much variety in them that there was really always something I could spec into that made it feel worthwhile. In Remnant 2, they have not only cut back on the number of traits you unlock in a playthrough from 50 to 30, but also made it that you can only unlock traits now through completing certain puzzles and killing certain bosses. They've also limited how many points you can put into them as well. So not only does this limit the variety of bonuses I can get, but also how many I can fully spec out. The good thing is that because I barely got any traits through my co-op playthrough that were worthwhile, it meant that I had no issues with the trait limit, but also meant that gaining new trait points lost all value because by the time I'd maxed out Vigor and Expertise, i.e. my health and skill cooldowns, there was nothing else really worth speccing into. I mean, the basic stats are there, Vigor and Spirit, Stamina and Expertise, but even then, Stamina wasn't really an issue for me in my co-op playthrough as enemy aggro got divided up between me and my teammates, but it was definitely more needed in my solo playthrough as there was a lot more focus on dodging and stamina usage was a lot more prevalent. You do get your class exclusive traits that you unlock along the way. For Medic, it was things like increased healing of other players using weapon mods, but those upgrade on their own, and unless you go out of your way to re-roll worlds to get specific traits that you want by killing certain bosses or by doing certain quests, for those that just want to casually play through the campaign, you're kind of limited by the options that are available to you, and so traits don't really affect you that much. Note, the devs have said that they're looking into the trait system, but overall, that's what I mean by this game kinda needs 2 playthroughs for you to get a picture of it, as a lot of the good traits, the good guns, the good mods, and the good gear is somewhat up to RNG. So some people might get all the good stuff in one run, whereas others might be given all the shit. But overall, the new trait system feels like a choked version of the first games, and it doesn't help that the reworked armor system further waters down systems that I think in the previous game worked so well. It's safe to say that armor in this game feels very pointless. In the first game, specific types of armor granted you bonuses. Slayer armor granted you bonus damage on reloads, bandit armor gave you a chance to have ammo automatically restored back to your gun, and having more pieces of armor in a set equipped increased these bonuses. In the first game, these armor sets, mixed with amulets and the rings, really allowed for some good build variety, and made using one set over another worthwhile. In Remnant 2, the devs have completely removed the armor set bonuses, so now all armor really does is just give you some base defense as well as some elemental resistance, and that's it. And it never felt like the elemental resistances or the base damage made much of a difference, and as I was getting no benefit out of using other armor sets other than just aesthetics, I just put on the armor with the highest defense value while still maintaining a weight limit that lets me roll a normal roll, and I didn't change it for the rest of the game. I don't know, it feels like armor sets are just made pretty redundant, to the point where you can't even upgrade them in the shop anymore. Instead, they replaced the set bonuses with 2 smaller systems, Mutators and Relic Shards. Mutators are essentially a second weapon mod that you can upgrade and put on your gun, and it literally gives you the same bonuses that the Remnant 1 armor sets did, just reduced. I used the Bandit Mutator, which was the same bonus as the Remnant 1 Bandit set, ammo back on hit. There were other mutators you could buy from vendors, as well as some you got from bosses, and although these mutators do have some nice attributes, I don't know why the devs felt that it was necessary to remove these gear set bonuses from armor sets. I guess it lets you attach specific mutators to specific guns, and as it's no longer linked to armor, I guess it makes it easier to swap weapons without having to change your armor if your armor set doesn't match the gun that you're using and how it fits in with your build. I don't know, it feels like Buildcraft now relies a lot more on the guns as opposed to the armor. And the appealing thing in the first game was that you could recognize the build the player was going based off the armor they were using. Like, it was very clear that someone wearing the Slayer armor was going for increased damage after reloading, Bandit gave you more ammo, so maybe they were going for, I don't know, longer shooting or using assault rifles or LMGs or something. Now they've all lumped the mutators into one kind of group, which is visually very hard to differentiate from each other in both the menu and on the gun itself, and it just feels like they made the system unnecessarily convoluted in a way. It's not a major turnoff. I don't know, I think I just need to put some more time into it to figure it out or decide how I feel, but yeah, I don't know. Armor just feels a little bit lackluster at the moment, but I guess it does mean that you can use whatever armor you want without sacrificing build or anything like that. The other system they introduced was Relic Shards, which is essentially Dragon Harp upgrades that again grant you some bonuses. However, this feels even more unsubstantial as the bonuses you get are tiny and a little vague. In my playthrough, I barely got any upgrades for these, and so I just didn't bother with them. I clicked on the Dragon Heart and I saw all of these shards, all of them indistinct from one another visually, forcing me to read through each of their descriptions and stats looking for one that looks good, just to find that none of them really have much of an effect. And again, for those who just want a more casual playthrough to the campaign, I don't think this system will add anything at all to their playthrough. And I'm sure the more intricate, experienced and build-crafty players will get value out of this, and I'm happy if they do. I'd be glad to see this work as intended. But I, as the more casual player, do not. Maybe playing longer will level these relics up to a point where they'll feel a bit more valuable, or maybe they'll feel more valuable on harder difficulties, but at least in my first playthrough, I feel like I didn't really get much value out of it. But even though I'm not a fan of some of these changes, this game is still so good. It's great. Great enough that everything this game does well very much outweighs everything that I said before. Performance could be a bit better, but even then I'm still having a blast playing this game, and I'll be honest, I've actually played a fair amount more of this game since finishing writing this review, and so I'm kind of just sticking this on the end of it, but yeah, this game is great. It's fun playing with friends, it's fun playing solo, and if you're new to the franchise or you've played the first and you're considering whether or not to get the second, let me put it this way, it's more Remnant. It's bigger, the environments are bolder, and exploration is so rewarding, particularly when you re-roll and get a different world and you walk into a different dungeon. I can't put enough emphasis on just how much is in this game. Each dungeon is different from the last, the puzzles are distinct, and there are so many of them that I really enjoy how it changes the pacing of the game. Sometimes you get hoarded by enemies, other times you're given a puzzle to solve and you can just chill out and take your time. If there's one bit of advice I can give for players starting this game, I would say that after finishing a world, re-roll it and do it again. Sure, getting to the end boss is, I suppose, the point of the game, but by taking your time with each world, re-rolling it and seeing all the variations of dungeons and puzzles and events and loot, it's just so much fun. And I know I said that the first game had some more memorable bosses, but I think this game definitely has more standout random events. But even in saying that, both games are great in their own right, and I don't think it even matters rating one higher than the other, because the fact is that I would happily play through both again. So yeah, this game is great, and I highly recommend checking it out.